The file was called Assessment 7 Gamma Human, and it had not been updated in 11 years. This was not unusual. The Galactic Conclave's Central Intelligence Directorate maintained threat assessment files on over 400 spacefaring species, and the resources required to keep every file current were considerable. Priority was assigned based on a species' relative military standing in the most recent assessment, which meant that species ranked low received infrequent updates, and species ranked very low received almost none at all. Humanity was ranked last, not last among minor powers, not last among newly spacefaring species, last among every documented spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, a distinction earned through 11-year-old data compiled during humanity's first fumbling years of interstellar contact, when Earth had possessed exactly 12 military vessels, no combat experience whatsoever, and a diplomatic corps that had shown up to its first Galactic Conclave session wearing the wrong ceremonial colors. The file's summary assessment read, in the clipped bureaucratic language of the Directorate's standard format, species demonstrates negligible military capacity, no documented combat record, and cultural predisposition toward diplomatic resolution of conflict. Threat classification, non-significant. Recommended review interval, 12 years. The 12-year review had been scheduled for the following spring. It would arrive, as it turned out, approximately 11 months too late. The first empire to discover the file was wrong was the Vorrkai Dominion on a Tuesday. Commander Sela Vreth of the Dominion's 3rd Expansion Fleet had been given a straightforward assignment: secure a disputed mining corridor in the outer territories that 3 separate species currently claimed, including, according to the corridor's most recent survey, a small human prospecting operation that had established an extraction facility on the corridor's most resource-rich asteroid 6 months earlier. The humans were not the primary complication. The Vorrkai's dispute with the Dracon Collective over the corridor had been simmering for years, and Vreth's orders were to establish a Dominion presence sufficient to discourage Dracon aggression while simultaneously persuading the minor claimants to withdraw their operations voluntarily. The human prospecting operation was listed in Vreth's briefing packet as a footnote, a trivial matter expected to resolve itself once the humans received a politely worded formal notice that the corridor was now under Dominion security protocols. Vreth dispatched the notice and turned her attention to the more pressing matter of positioning her fleet against potential Dracon movement. The human response arrived 6 hours later. It was not a withdrawal acknowledgement. It was a counterfiling with the Galactic Conclave's Resource Rights Tribunal, citing 17 separate precedents under interstellar mining law, 3 of which Vreth had never heard of, attached to a 12-page legal brief of a quality that the Dominion's own legal division, when Vreth forwarded it for review, described as thorough and structurally sound. They're contesting the notice, Vreth told her first officer, Commander Trell, with the mild puzzlement of someone encountering an unexpected obstacle on what was supposed to be a routine operation. Through the tribunal. They've filed an injunction. Can they do that? Apparently they can. Our legal division says the precedents they've cited are real and the brief is competently drafted. Vreth read through the summary her legal advisors had attached. They're requesting a tribunal hearing within 45 days. Until then, the injunction prevents us from compelling their withdrawal by force. What do we do? Vreth considered the conclave assessment file she had read during her briefing. Non-significant, no documented combat record, cultural predisposition toward diplomatic resolution. We attend the tribunal, she said, and we bring better lawyers. What neither Vreth nor her legal division fully understood was that the human prospecting team on the asteroid was not staffed by people with any particular expertise in interstellar mining law. It was staffed by 6 geologists, 2 engineers, and a habitat technician named Rosa Chen, who had, during the 6-month deployment, read through the Galactic Conclave's complete resource rights code in her spare time because she had exhausted every other entertainment option available on a small asteroid extraction facility with limited bandwidth. Rosa had not filed the brief herself. She had contacted Earth's Colonial Resource Office, explained the situation in a brief message, and attached her own 30-page annotated summary of applicable law, which the Colonial Resource Office's legal team had used as the foundation for the tribunal filing. "Did it work?" she asked, during her next communication window with Earth, 3 days after the filing. "The injunction was granted," confirmed the Colonial Resource Office coordinator on the other end. "The Vorrkai have agreed to attend tribunal." Rosa allowed herself a small smile and returned to her geological surveys. Commander Rheth attended the tribunal 41 days later, with a legal team of 8 specialists assembled specifically for the case. The human representative was a junior attorney named Marco Pellegrini, 29 years old, 4 years out of his graduate program, who had been assigned the case on the grounds that he was available and had expressed particular interest in resource rights law during his intake review. The tribunal session lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, the presiding adjudicator issued a preliminary finding in humanity's favor on 11 of the 17 contested precedents and requested additional documentation on the remaining 6. Rheth's legal team, reviewing the decision in their hotel suite near the Conclave tribunal chambers, was largely silent for a long moment before her lead counsel spoke. "They were better prepared than we were," he said. "They sent a single junior attorney," Rheth replied. "I'm aware." Rheth returned to her fleet, having secured neither the mining corridor nor the human withdrawal she had been tasked to accomplish, filed a report with Dominion Command that attributed the setback to unexpectedly sophisticated human legal capacity, and recommended that any future operations involving human-claimed territory include significantly more thorough preparation. Her superiors, reading the report, made a note to verify the accuracy of the Conclave's current human assessment file. The note was filed in a queue of administrative tasks and not actioned before events overtook it. The second empire to discover the file was wrong was the Rheth Principality on the following Thursday. The Principality's border security forces had been tracking a vessel they suspected of carrying contraband biological samples through a protected corridor near the human colony world of New Geneva. The vessel had identified itself as a human-flagged medical research ship on a standard colonial supply run, and the Principality's initial scan had returned results consistent with that identification. But Border Captain Horan Seld's instincts, sharpened by 12 years of corridor patrol, had flagged something about the vessel's power signature that he couldn't immediately explain. Seld ordered the vessel to heave to for secondary inspection. The vessel complied without protest. What Seld found during the inspection was not contraband biological samples. It was, in his later report, described as a research vessel operating within all applicable treaty standards, crewed by 12 individuals, carrying equipment registered under legitimate scientific protocols, whose documentation was more comprehensively organized than any equivalent human vessel we have previously inspected. What Seld did not find, but would have been considerably more interested in, had he known to look for it, was the separate compartment beneath the main research bay that had been constructed with materials specifically designed to return standard scan results indistinguishable from the ship's registered hull composition, containing a sensor array that had spent the past 4 months quietly documenting Principality border patrol movements, frequencies, and coverage gaps along the entire contested corridor. The research ship was not a spy vessel in any formal sense. It was operated by a university consortium conducting authorized scientific research, and every document it carried was genuine. The sensor array had been installed by the research team lead, Professor Janine Astor, who had noticed during her first month of operations that Principality border patrols passed through a specific gap in her research area at regular intervals, and had added monitoring equipment to track what she characterized in her research logs as an interesting example of patrol distribution patterns in contested space. Professor Astor's research logs, it should be noted, were also genuine. She found patrol distribution patterns genuinely interesting. The fact that the resulting documentation would also be useful to Earth's Colonial Defense Intelligence Division, which had quietly funded a portion of her research grant for exactly this reason, was something she considered a pleasant secondary benefit rather than her primary motivation. Seld completed his inspection, found nothing actionable, and allowed the vessel to continue. He filed a report noting that human vessels operating in the corridor appeared to be operating with a level of procedural sophistication somewhat higher than he had expected based on the Principality's existing species assessments. His supervisor read the report, added a marginal note suggesting that border security update its human interaction protocols, and moved on to 17 other items requiring attention that day. In a quiet office at Earth Intelligence Command, a woman named Director Ren Okafor maintained a running file she called the observation log, which contained reports of human-alien interactions that, taken individually, seemed unremarkable but, taken together, suggested a consistent pattern she had been tracking for 3 years. The legal filing in the Vorrkai corridor dispute went into the observation log on a Wednesday. Seld's inspection report, obtained through the Conclave's standard information sharing protocols, went into the observation log on a Friday. Okafor read both, added brief annotations to each, and updated a separate summary document she had titled, with the dry humor that characterized most of her internal communications, "Things that are happening quietly while everyone is watching for loud things." The summary document was 47 pages long. The third empire to discover the file was wrong was the Tharric Supremacy on the following Sunday, and the Supremacy's discovery was considerably less quiet than the preceding two. The Tharric were the largest military power in the Outer Territories, controlling 19 systems through a combination of conquest and compelled alliance that they characterized, in their official communications, as a cooperative security framework. Their assessment of humanity was similar to the Conclave's general file: minor, newly spacefaring, non-threatening, easily managed if the question ever arose. The question arose because of Admiral Grell Tharris, who commanded the Supremacy's expansion fleet and who had spent the preceding 6 months planning an operation to bring 3 contested systems along the human border under Supremacy control. The operation had been designed entirely around the assumption that human military response to territorial pressure would be limited, disorganized, and ultimately symbolic. A brief protest followed by a practical acceptance of the new strategic reality. Grell launched his fleet on a Sunday because his operations calendar had identified it as an optimal window for achieving tactical surprise against the Drekkan monitoring stations in the area, which had nothing to do with the humans, but happened to leave the same window open for movement toward the contested systems. What Grell encountered was not limited, disorganized, or symbolic. The 3 contested systems each contained human colonial installations of varying sizes, the largest being a terraforming project that had been underway for 4 years on a planet designated New Carthage. What none of Grell's intelligence had accounted for was that the Colonial Defense Act, passed by Earth's coalition government 3 years earlier in the quiet aftermath of the New Meridian engagement, had established mandatory defensive infrastructure requirements for every human colonial installation above a certain population threshold. New Carthage had a population of 80,000. It had been building its mandatory defensive infrastructure for 3 years. When Grell's fleet arrived in the system expecting a lightly defended terraforming camp, it encountered instead a coordinated network of orbital defense platforms, surface-based missile installations, and a colonial militia that had been training for exactly this contingency twice weekly since the infrastructure requirements had been established. The engagement that followed lasted 9 hours. It was not a victory for either side in any clean sense. Grell's fleet inflicted significant damage on the orbital platforms, and the colonial militia took casualties that nobody on Earth would ever fully stop grieving. But Grell did not achieve orbital control of New Carthage, and his fleet withdrew to reassess with considerably fewer ships than it had arrived with. Facing a defense that had functioned with a coordination and effectiveness his own intelligence had told him was impossible from a civilian colonial population. "Explain to me what just happened," Grell said to his intelligence officer, Commander Rheth Principality, during the fleet's withdrawal to the rally point. Principality had no satisfying answer, because the answer required acknowledging that the intelligence he had provided was based on an 11-year-old Conclave file that nobody in the Supremacy's intelligence division had thought to verify against current conditions. "Their defensive infrastructure exceeded our estimates significantly," Principality said, which was accurate but understated the problem considerably. By how much? Prahl reviewed the engagement data with the particular discomfort of someone being asked to quantify a mistake they had contributed to. By approximately a factor of 8, he said, possibly more. Grell was quiet for a long moment, watching the withdrawal telemetry on his command display. Where did our estimate come from? The Conclave's Central Intelligence Directorate Assessment. Assessment 7 Gamma Human. When was it last updated? Prahl checked. He checked twice, because the first result seemed wrong. 11 years ago, he said, the news of the New Carthage engagement reached Earth's Security Council 4 hours after it ended. Delivered by Colonial Defense Command with the controlled urgency of people who had prepared for this kind of scenario and did not intend to be caught unprepared in their response. General Priya Sharma, who had spent 3 years since the Dranic crisis quietly overseeing the implementation of the Colonial Defense Act, reviewed the engagement data with an expression that those who knew her recognized as intense focus rather than alarm. They hit the platform network hard, she said to the council. We lost 11 platforms in the initial engagement. The militia performed above simulation projections in their ground-based response. She paused. The Tharric fleet took damage consistent with facing a defense approximately 3 times stronger than they expected. They pulled out. What's our assessment of their next move? President Bello asked. They'll investigate what they hit before they try again, Sharma said. They expected something much weaker. What they found is going to require them to rebuild their entire picture of human colonial defense capacity. She allowed herself a controlled pause. That rebuilding process is going to take them some time. And during that time, they're going to start asking where their original estimate came from. And when they find out it was an 11-year-old conclave file, when they find that out, Sharma said, we want every other species in the galaxy to find it out at the same time. Director Okafor presented her 47-page observation log to the Security Council 2 days after the New Carthage engagement, in a briefing that she had privately titled, for her own amusement, The Complete Picture. For 3 years, she said, human operations across 16 different sectors have been quietly demonstrating capabilities that the Conclave's current assessment file does not account for. Legal sophistication in the Vorrkai corridor dispute, intelligence gathering capacity in the Rheth border zone, colonial defensive infrastructure in the New Carthage engagement. None of these, individually, is sufficient to revise the Conclave's overall picture. Collectively, they paint a portrait of a species that has been developing in directions the 11-year-old assessment never anticipated. What do you recommend we do with this? The council president asked. I recommend we do nothing to correct the Conclave's file, Okafor said, to a room of surprised expressions. Not yet. I recommend we let the 3 incidents from the past week do their own work. The Vorrkai are already investigating. The Rheth border security has filed update requests. The Tharric Supremacy is currently conducting what I estimate is a very uncomfortable internal review of how their intelligence division produced estimates 8 times below actual capability, and when they all arrive at the same conclusion, then we ensure that conclusion reaches the Galactic Conclave in a form that's complete, accurate, and presented in our own terms, rather than assembled from 3 separate incident reports that make us look dangerous without context. Okafor closed her summary document. The file says we're ranked last in combat potential. I would like the file's revision to be an event that happens once, thoroughly, and on our schedule. The Galactic Conclave's Central Intelligence Directorate received formal update requests regarding Assessment 7 Gamma Human from 3 separate member states within the same 5-day window. The Vorrkai Dominion citing the tribunal proceedings, the Rheth Principality citing border inspection anomalies, and the Tharric Supremacy citing what they described, with considerable understatement, as a significant discrepancy between assessed and observed colonial defense capacity. The Directorate's Review Committee, responsible for prioritizing assessment updates across 400 species files, found themselves in the unusual position of scheduling a review that 3 separate parties were simultaneously requesting with an urgency that stood in sharp contrast to the file's 12-year recommended review interval. The review session was scheduled. Earth's coalition government, informed of the scheduling through standard diplomatic channels, was invited to provide supporting documentation. Okafor's team had spent the preceding 3 weeks preparing exactly that documentation, a comprehensive account of human development across military, legal, intelligence, and colonial infrastructure domains, calibrated with the same precision Okafor brought to everything she produced. It was not, she had noted privately, a complete account. It was a thorough account of what the Conclave needed to know. The things it did not need to know yet, she kept in a separate file that she had titled, with her characteristic dry humor, Spring Review. The Conclave's revised assessment of humanity was completed 6 weeks after the New Carthage engagement and distributed to all member states simultaneously. Its summary read, in the same clipped bureaucratic format as the original, species demonstrates significant and previously undocumented military, legal, and intelligence capacity. Colonial infrastructure development substantially exceeds prior estimates. Threat classification revised from non-significant to regional power. Active. Recommended review interval, 2 years. The Vorrkai Dominion read the revised assessment and quietly withdrew their competing claim to the mining corridor, settling the tribunal case on terms favorable to the human prospecting team the week after the assessment's publication. The Rheth Principality increased its border patrol coordination protocols with human colonial administrators along the contested corridor, a process that began awkwardly and improved gradually, as both sides discovered they had more interest in the corridor's stability than in whatever advantage either might gain from maintaining tension. The Tharric Supremacy entered what its government called a strategic reassessment period, which its neighbors correctly interpreted as a government trying to understand how it had attacked a species it believed was ranked last in combat potential and had come away needing to rebuild a third of one of its expansion fleets. The reassessment period lasted considerably longer than the Supremacy's government had initially communicated to its own population. Admiral Grell Tharris, reassigned from Expansion Fleet Command during the reassessment, spent the following months doing something he had rarely done in his career: reading. Specifically, reading everything available about human development since first contact, in an attempt to understand how 11 years of evolution had produced such a substantial gap between Assessment 7 Gamma Human and what he had actually encountered at New Carthage. What struck him most, reading through the available record, was not any single capability or development. It was the pattern, the same pattern Director Okafor had been tracking for 3 years, of a species that had been quietly, consistently, and without announcement becoming something considerably more capable than anyone watching from outside had thought to account for. He put the files down one evening and thought for a long moment about what it meant to underestimate something consistently, across multiple domains, over more than a decade. Then he thought about what it meant that, despite 11 years of development that had produced legal expertise and intelligence networks and colonial defense infrastructure, and a fleet capacity 8 times larger than his own estimates, humanity had not once initiated a conflict or sought territorial expansion beyond its established colonies. He thought about what a species that had consistently chosen not to use capabilities it had been consistently building might be saving those capabilities for. It was not a comfortable line of thought. But it was, he reflected, a considerably more honest assessment of the situation than the one his intelligence division had provided. And honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was the beginning of any strategy worth having. Rosa Chen completed her geological survey of the asteroid 6 weeks after the tribunal concluded, filed her extraction report with Earth's Colonial Resource Office, and rotated back to Earth for her scheduled leave period. The mining corridor, now formally recognized under Conclave resource rights protocols as a human-claimed zone, continued its extraction operations under the protection of the legal framework she had helped establish. Marco Pellegrini, back at his desk in the Coalition's legal division, received a note from his division director informing him that his performance in the Vorrkai tribunal proceedings had been flagged for recognition in his annual review. He filed the note, returned to the 17 other cases currently on his desk, and did not think of himself as having done anything particularly unusual, because he had simply done his job with the tools available to him. which was, in his experience, all anyone ever really did. Professor Astor returned from her research deployment with sensor data that produced 3 published papers on patrol distribution patterns in contested space and 1 intelligence report that she never saw in its final form, but whose conclusions she understood. In broad terms, from the questions she was asked during her debrief, Director Okafor updated her observation log with entries from the week's events, added a final summary note, and closed the document she had titled The Complete Picture. She opened the one titled Spring Review and began adding to it. The file called Assessment 7 Gamma Human had been updated, ranked last no longer. In the Directorate's new filing system, humanity appeared in the middle of the regional power tier, surrounded by civilizations that had spent decades or centuries establishing that standing. It was an accurate assessment of what the Directorate knew. Director Okafor considered it, in the privacy of her own evaluation, a reasonable starting point.